Hey, welcome everyone. Welcome to our second bootcamp for the week on utilizing New Era funding. My name is Allie. I'm a manager at RMI and your MC for today. For those new to RMI, we are an independent, nonpartisan, global nonprofit organization of 600 experts across disciplines working to accelerate the clean energy transition and improve lives. Next slide. Yesterday, we'll be focused on defining an ambitious New Era plan. To bring back the analogy that I used yesterday, we can think about applying to New Era like playing a board game. Yesterday, we walked through the rules of the game and the different pieces you have at your disposal and how you can use them. Today, we are diving deeper into some of the moves you can make with those pieces and how they will all play out over time. We designed this content to be a 201 level rather than kind of an introduction or 101, given what is already being presented by others in the space. So this is really geared towards folks who are designing applications as we're getting into the nitty gritty of a lot of the processes and steps that you'll need to take over the next few months. And also any energy and finance nerds out here like ourselves, you'll love this as well. A few logistics, given the sensitivity around these applications, we're running this through a Zoom webinar so that participation and Q&A will remain confidential. If you have a question, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, which will send the question to just our panelists, and we'll answer any questions out loud or directly and privately to you in the Q&A feature. With that, will introduce our team for today. Next slide, please. Sam and Uday are our presenters. They are both members of RMI's electricity team who focused on financial topics related to federal policy. And Michael is our Q&A moderator for today. He's also on the electricity team working on financial topics related to federal policy with them, and he focuses on distributed energy projects as well. With that, I'll pass it off to Uday to say a few framing words to kick off the session. Thanks.
Well, thank you so much, Ali, and thanks to everyone for joining us again today or for joining us for the first time. I wanted to first start by providing a bit of an overview of what we hope to do today. In our last session, we spent the time really laying out, as Ali said, the rules of the game, trying to give you a sense of what was possible with the financing support that could come through New Era. Today, we want to take some of that thinking around what financially is feasible, given the constraints that cooperatives face. And as Ali said, figure out how you play the game. What can you actually do with that money in terms of the types of resources that you can bring to bear and some of the challenges and opportunities associated with matching the characteristics of different portfolios of clean resources that would give you the greatest chance of getting the support with some of the financing options that are available, and discussing ways in which some of the risks associated with different options may end up having an effect on which of those choices that you end up making. We really want to talk a little bit about how you can be as ambitious as you can given your particular risk tolerance and the role that your particular cooperative plays moving forward, and to discuss and push a little bit on which resources make the most sense for the use of New Era directly versus how can New Era be used to address perhaps indirectly some of the challenges that you might face. So really thinking about what should you do with this funding, and maybe more importantly, what should you perhaps wait on doing moving forward? All that being said, I want to reiterate what we said yesterday before we jump in, which is the federal government ultimately is the source of final information and guidance on the use of all of these programs. While we expect that RUS will continue posting clarifications and guidance, and we expect Treasury will be doing the same, our information is to the best of our knowledge, current as of this morning. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Sam, who's going to start with a bit of a recap of some of the discussion that we had yesterday around the financial structures, to remind you of that before we jump in to the topic at hand.
Thanks, Uday. Next slide, please. We know some folks on the call may have had a chance to join us for our presentation yesterday. If you were not able to join, we'll make that recording available online. But we wanted to start today with a check-in question. And this is really sort of with the acknowledgement that our intention with these presentations and our work really further along in the summer as cooperatives form applications for the New Era program is to support applicants in thinking through how to maximize their chances of securing funding from the program and make use of those funds in the way that best serves their members. So help provide support where useful to think through what makes a strong New Era application that meets the needs of cooperatives and their members. And so in service of that, we wanted to begin with a check-in question, which we'd invite you to answer using the Q&A feature in the presentation. And that is, after having a night to digest the presentation yesterday, what questions are you holding? What is not clear to you? Or what have we not covered that you hope we get to today or in a future session? So please take a moment, think about the question, respond in the Q&A box, and we'll try to address some of these questions during our Q&A portions of our session today. And if we don't get to all of the questions, we will think about them either for the design of future webinar sessions or other resources or one-on-one engagements. We always invite folks to be in touch with questions as well. So I'll pause for a moment as you think about this question. Please answer in the Q&A. And as you think about that, I'll get started with talking through the agenda and doing a quick recap of some of the information that we presented yesterday. So we're going to start today with just a recap of some of the information that we covered yesterday that focused really on how to think through developing a funding package that's designed really to enable investments in a resource portfolio that you'd be interested in deploying using New Era funds. And then we'll move into kind of the main focus for today, which is first talking about the types of investments and sort of getting more specific about what applicants can think about in terms of forming a proposal for New Era and the resources they can deploy under the New Era program. Spending most of our time, and next slide, please. And we'll spend most of our time on a series of examples, really, that we think are going to be appealing to a lot of cooperative applicants. But first, thinking through sort of why RMI is focused in this space and a recap of yesterday, we really see the New Era program as designed to resolve some important financing challenges that many cooperatives have historically faced and faced before the Inflation Reduction Act. And this is a challenge being able to quickly raise equity in order to have the flexibility on balance sheets to make investments in a cost-effective way for members. And New Era can really help with that through providing grants. Direct pay tax credits are also really useful here. An ownership challenge where cooperatives didn't have the ability to easily own clean energy assets with the clean energy tax credits. And direct pay helps resolve that and is really going to, we think, help cooperatives provide more direct access to clean energy resources for their members. And finally, a stranded asset challenge where cooperatives are seeing stranded asset costs that they'd like to help mitigate or resolve for their members. And we think New Era can be really helpful and is designed to be helpful in this regard as well. And so in summary, we're excited about New Era and the Inflation Reduction Act writ large, in part because we think that it can give cooperative members easier and more direct access to some low cost technologies and really technologies with lots of benefits. Next slide, please. And so again, yesterday, we really focused on thinking through how to develop a funding plan and a plan for requesting a combination of grants and loans that could be best suited to deliver the physical resource portfolio that a cooperative might be interested in deploying. And to this end, we talked about the different ways that government loans can be leveraged to create a financing package. And so what the slide here really demonstrates is that New Era offers loans at different costs. So you can receive as low as a 0% interest rate loan. New Era is offering loans at a 2% fixed interest rate, loans at treasuries, and we also have loans at treasuries plus 37.5 basis points, really illustrating a slightly higher cost loan option. And what we find when we look at how those loans would be able to be leveraged is that loans at a lower interest rate and can receive about 2.25 times their value in appropriated dollars. So this is looking at, or 2.5 times. So this is looking at a situation where you might take the entire $970 million maximum New Era award and try to understand how much sort of lending would be possible if that was all taken as a loan at a certain interest rate. And so really just demonstrating that loans at higher interest rates can leverage more and enable a higher level of financing. And next slide, please. Then we walked through some of our modeling, really to show that different situations where a cooperative could take in a combination of a grant, a loan at a different cost, and either the production tax credit or the investment tax credit to realize a sort of intended resource portfolio. So we had a situation where a cooperative was paying off the costs of a stranded asset while making a new investment in wind, solar, and wind, solar, and storage resources. And really what we are attempting to show in this modeling, or the modeling is showing us, is that with the same appropriation, if a cooperative chooses the lowest possible cost loan, with a production tax credit, there isn't enough equity pulled in through a grant because of the sort of lower leverage on the 0% loan to really fund the full resource. So we see here that the financing enabled is $2.7 billion. In this scenario, another $1.5 billion or another $1 billion is required to sort of meet the necessary value of the resource. And so we see in our modeling that a 0% loan with PTC is not necessarily the best option to take in the financing required to realize a resource portfolio. And next slide. In contrast, taking the treasury loan, the higher cost loan, allows more leverage, allows more borrowing with the same amount of appropriation, and also allows the applicant to take in more money as a grant. And so in summary of this section, what we are showing in this case is that we find in many situations taking a higher sort of cost loan, a loan at treasuries, really enables an applicant to take in more grant, bring in more equity through a grant to allow more borrowing that can lead to better net present value savings over a business as usual case for the cooperative. And we'll get into today what we want to do is kind of show this case in the context of some of the risks involved with different types of resource investments, and try to draw connections more clearly between the financial strategy that we outlined yesterday with some of the actual technologies that cooperatives will be considering in their new era applications. Next slide. And so one thing we want to acknowledge is yesterday we didn't spend a lot of time talking about the actual technologies. And in part that's because we know that cooperatives around the country are in different situations in terms of the resources that they are best able to deploy and what they're interested in considering. And cooperatives really know their systems and their members best, and will be trying to form or come up with proposals that use packages of resources that best serve the needs of their system and of their members. And so the intention yesterday was really have some generalized logic around how to form a funding proposal that can meet a physical resource portfolio that a cooperative is interested in. But we do see a number of common themes that we think many cooperatives will be considering as they apply for new era funding. And so today we're going to spend most of our time walking through these different cases. So first we'll think a little bit about options to own and purchase wind, solar, and short duration storage resources, which we think will be an option that many cooperatives are considering in a new era and will be an appealing option. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the opportunities and risks with different ways of structuring the procurement of clean energy and short duration storage resources. We'll touch on options for dealing with stranded asset costs and different ways that we think cooperatives can think about the financing opportunities for dealing with stranded asset costs through new era and tax credits. We'll talk about clean firm resources, and carbon capture and storage in particular is called out as an option within new era. And then we'll talk about demand and distribution side investments and some of the investments that we think distribution cooperatives in particular will be interested in looking at and assessing as part of their new era applications. Next slide, please. But first, we wanted to back up and sort of lay the groundwork for the types of technologies that New Era invites and allows and are eligible for the program. Next slide. And really the main point here is that there's a lot of flexibility in this program. The main investments allowed in New Era are categorized as renewable energy systems, zero emission systems, and carbon capture and storage systems. But importantly, the guidance for New Era really calls out different types of activities that can support the deployment or improve the energy efficiency associated with a renewable energy system or a zero emission system in particular. And that can include things that we think are pretty exciting, like transmission improvements, even funding for new transmission and energy storage systems, as well as different technology and upgrades that can really be helpful when deploying some of these systems and we think are pretty important and useful. And that flexibility can be great to have as you're thinking about putting into place a large renewable energy or zero emission system. It also lends some complexity because there are lots of sort of decisions to make about the deployment and about making the case for emissions reductions, which is the competitive portion of the program. So next slide. And so we want to also talk about these different cases that we'll walk through today in the context of the Achievable Reductions tool, which is an Excel spreadsheet that the Rural Utility Service has made available and will be using to take in applications. So applicants will be using this tool to input the information about their resource plan and use it to calculate the expected emissions reductions. And RUS will use this tool to then score or grade applications and determine which are best suited for funding under the program. So it's an important tool to kind of understand. And RUS has done a webinar on this and has shared a number of resources to help applicants kind of understand how to apply the tool as part of their application. But we note that the resources that can be used under New Era, there's a lot of flexibility. And so creating a tool that can capture all that flexibility is quite challenging. And there will be some work that cooperatives need to do really to figure out how to best express their plan within the context of the Achievable Reductions tool. I think this is particularly important as we see with technologies on the distribution and demand side and technologies that can really enable some flexibility in the system and support the deployment of a zero carbon or a renewable energy system. And so we'll call this out later in the session, but some of the work that we see applicants needing to do is determining the best way to articulate the benefits of some of the technologies that aren't identified explicitly in the Achievable Reduction tool, and figuring out how to make sure that the benefits are sort of clear to RUS as they form their proposal for what they would like financed. Next slide, please. So now I'll turn it over to Uday, and I want to spend again most of the session today talking through some of the examples of specific combinations of resources that we see as appealing and important to many applicants, and connecting that to kind of the logic that we've laid out yesterday about how to really form a funding proposal that we think can best serve members. That, Uday, over to you.
Thank you so much. And if we can move to the next slide. So as we think about what New Era can address specifically, we believe that New Era does have the opportunity for a lot of cooperatives, as we mentioned earlier, to address a lot of the barriers that kept them from investing in clean energy previously. That being said, there are a number of key challenges that make this particular application process challenging to execute on. The first one is that as a lot of cooperatives are looking at what they could do, the options are numerous and often it can be very difficult to figure out which options are best for which program, because we also have numerous programs that potentially could support cooperatives doing a number of these different investments. And here, as we'll discuss, we believe that the New Era program is particularly suited to invest in commercially proven technologies and can be helpful in helping a cooperative as part of its portfolio of actions over the next decade to take advantage of all of the resources in not just the Inflation Reduction Act, but also the bipartisan infrastructure bill, et cetera. This piece is particularly useful for the commercially proven energy technologies that reduce emissions, while allowing a cooperative to, while deploying those technologies, build its balance sheets. And we believe in particular, solar, wind, and storage are, short duration storage are a particularly good match for that in this way, to sort of make that a little easier for at least cooperatives that focus on supply side resources. The second challenge is there isn't much time. And here we believe that it's going to be critical to really begin outreach to developers and other key stakeholders. There's a short timeline for application, and there are other time constraints that we'll dig into in a little bit. We do believe that this is the right time to start, if you haven't already done so, reaching out and building those relationships with potential clean energy developers to get started in the process. Third, we know that the rules are still being set. This process is evolving as USDA is executing a very large program for the first time. And it's going to be important as a result to really consider carefully many different financing options before defining the final plan. The direct pay tax credits, for example, are still an uncertainty, but that's why it's helpful to go through what might be possible in order to really set yourself up to take advantage, to be ready to take advantage of the rules as they are finalized, to have a plan and a strategy for using the flexibility that is available in the final rules to really achieve the maximum value for your members. And with that, let's talk a little bit more about the specific options that we're going to be looking at in this conversation on the next slide. So specifically, we're going to be focusing on 4 different areas, and I'm going to start with basically the simplest one, which is really thinking about how to use New Era along with other resources to facilitate the ownership, cooperative ownership, or purchase of wind, solar, and short duration storage. So if we move on to the next slide, why are we focusing on these first? And really, I just want to start out with the observation that really we have finally seen storage and as well as solar and wind decline in cost to the point where, with the New Era incentives in place, particularly with bonus adders, the ultimate cost to members of installing these resources to reduce the utilization of other resources or to meet incremental or marginal load has fallen sufficiently as measured by a levelized cost that it really starts to make sense to offset at least some level of system load with these resources. And for the first time, with the shift in the nature of the incentives to allow for direct pay and some of the New Era incentives, it actually makes sense for that to be done not necessarily with purchase power, but with owned power in a way that hasn't been true earlier. So as we'll discuss on the next slide, there are still some trade-offs, even in spite of these changes, between asset ownership and still continuing to purchase power. And for some cooperatives, it may still make more sense to purchase power. That being said, with the changes in laws, we finally have a situation that direct ownership allows for the tax benefits to be passed through to members in a way that reduces costs in the near term, that both on an NPV basis and in terms of sort of the impact on members' bills in the near term can allow these tax benefits to really reduce costs for customers in the same way that that would be true if the power was purchased or if the power was owned by regulated utilities and other entities that were taxable entities and could enjoy these investments. Secondly, with direct ownership, now with the choice of an investment tax credit and direct pay, the investment tax credit percentages being up to between 30 and 50% of project costs and paid very soon after, immediately after deployment of the resource, mean that the investment tax credit with direct pay can actually be used to substitute for member equity that otherwise might have either required additional capital raises or reduced the flexibility of the utility to execute other investment needs because of the need to devote equity to this particular use. So this is a way that ownership can allow for cost reduction on your system without necessarily taking up space on your balance sheet or removing your flexibility on your balance sheet to meet other needs. Third, of course, ownership allows you to take direct advantage of your natural cost of capital advantage as a cooperative rather than a for-profit or regulated entity. And finally, direct ownership allows you to have more control over assets than you otherwise would if you were purchasing that power on a forward-looking basis. On the other hand, there are benefits from, continue to be benefits from a purchase power agreement. You're not going to be on the hook for O&M, or generally you don't take the risk of the physical risk associated with the asset, except to some degree to address replacement power if something does go wrong. You don't need to necessarily devote your balance sheet as much to enabling the financing of the PPA. Of course, again, the caveat there is depends on enough PPAs will affect your ability to finance to the extent to which a credit rating agency looks as the PPA as debt. And you also may be able to, through a purchase PPA, get the advantage of bulk procurement if an asset, for example, is selling power to a number of PPAs, et cetera, or a number of different cooperatives, et cetera. The only risk here is we should note that because the New Era program really does require that all of the disbursements, ultimately that this money is used by 2031, this may create a need to prepay PPAs that extend beyond 2031. So again, we think that it is, given these different changes, and given the program and the New Era program, we think it is worthwhile for a lot of cooperatives to reconsider direct ownership relative to what was possible a year ago. So we'll move on to the next slide. So let's talk about one of those reasons to reconsider ownership in a little bit more detail, which is ultimately, we believe that the direct pay investment tax credit can be quite powerful for a number of co-ops. And part of that is because of the up to 50% in direct pay investment tax credit that is available. That 50% refers to a fraction of original investment or project costs. Now that comes from a base of 30% as long as prevailing wage requirements are met. And we'll note that the investment tax credit is available for storage in particular, as well as for solar, and can be also taken for wind if need be. The 30% base can be supplemented with 10% if domestic content is used. Now, we believe that that's going to be somewhat challenging. And another 10% if energy communities, if the asset is placed in an energy community. Again, particularly interesting here is that 10% adder is one that could be met if, for example, a storage asset is placed at the site of a retired fossil asset, or one that will be retired or is expected to be retired. So that's an opportunity in particular for a lot of cooperatives with existing assets. The one caveat here is that the investment tax credit, well, while it is, again, eligible for direct pay, that means that there is a payment from the government coming after the installation and start of operations of the asset. Well, of course, that is after financing for the acquisition of the asset needed to have already been arranged. And so there can be a delay here in when the direct payment from the government for the ITC comes in relative to the financing need. However, so there is a need for bridge financing to really make up the timing difference between when this direct pay tax credit is available and when this asset comes online. The production tax credit is often an even more attractive incentive from a net present value loan basis. And it also gets an additional 10% adder for domestic content for energy communities. However, unlike with the investment tax credit, that is a 10% increase in the credit rather than additional 10% for each of them, which means that the production tax credit adders for domestic content and energy communities are relatively smaller than that provided for the ITC. That being said, the production tax credit in most areas across the country with even decent solar or wind resources is likely to be more cost effective and provide a greater NPV benefit. But now, unlike with the direct pay investment tax credit, there is no possibility to use this directly to generate equity. So you would have to use some kind of financing mechanism to take the full NPV value and translate it into additional equity in a meaningful way, such as a tax equity arrangement, if you wanted to do so. Now, that isn't necessary, and indeed, it can offset the need for further equity raises from your members, for example, as it comes in and is directly paid off over time. And indeed, that's the way that we really think about it. So, but still, if you need upfront equity to avoid an immediate hit to your balance sheet, the solar PTC isn't necessarily going to help with that, even though on an NPV basis, it is more attractive. So if we move on to the next slide, I want to talk a little bit more about, in particular, the energy communities benefit. And here you'll see a map that was provided by the Department of the Department of Energy, I think it is, trying to provide an initial, though not finalized, view of where across the country there are census tracts such that if the clean energy assets that I just discussed are cited in these areas, they are highly likely to qualify for the energy community tax credit. And in particular, I want to point you to the orange and yellow shaded areas. Those are ones that are fairly certain to be likely. Those are areas where there has been a coal closure or near a coal closure. That is one of the criteria for the energy community tax credit bonus. All of these census tracts are highly likely to qualify. If your assets are placed within them, they're highly likely to qualify for this 10% bonus. Now, the blue area is a little ambiguous, as these are areas that meet part of another threshold, that there is enough fossil fuel employment to satisfy the energy community tax credit bonus, but there is also a further requirement on income that has not yet been released by the federal government. So there is a caveat, there is still some risk that those communities may or may not, depending on the level of income, qualify for the energy communities bonus. And beyond this, there is one other criteria, which is that brownfields also qualify. And unfortunately, this map does not yet include the brownfield. So consider this map as a guide, as a starting point, but there may be additional criteria. And if you have an EPA brownfield, or you're fairly certain that your community has income that's below the that might meet the employment threshold, or the income threshold associated with the energy community tax credit bonus, which we're happy to talk about later, then it is possible that they will qualify. And as you can see, there are a lot of rural communities across the country that are likely to qualify for this particular bonus, and hence the relevance to a lot of cooperatives. We can move on to the next slide, please. Now, that being said, there is one caveat and a risk with direct pay that we want to make sure that you're fully aware of, which is that direct pay tax credit will require meeting domestic content requirements. So that is, if you want to elect direct pay, over time, there is a requirement that electing direct pay requires that you also meet a domestic content requirement. So in some ways, this is the downside to direct pay. Right now, for 2023 and 2024, that requires that the manufactured product, ultimately the panels, what you're ultimately deploying, has at least 40% domestic content for 2023 and 2024. And over time, that increases to 45% in 2025 and 50 and 55% in 26 and 27 onwards. Now, the difficulty is that if you're electing direct pay, you can elect that direct pay for an asset that begins construction this year without having to necessarily meet that domestic content requirement. But if you wait to start construction, or if you wait for a developer to start construction on a project until next year, you would have a 10% penalty on direct pay if that developer is unable to meet that 40% manufactured product domestic content requirement. And then that you would only receive 85% of the credit if that's true in 2025. And beginning in 2026 onwards, if you try to start construction of an asset and want to receive direct pay, you have to meet the domestic content requirement. However, and this is an important caveat, start of construction triggers a 4-year safe harbor. So if a developer that you're working with starts construction, which is not very hard to do, the requirements of start of construction are relatively minimal, and usually most developers are able to do that on their own. If they start construction by the end of 2023, they would not need to actually transfer ownership or start operations on that asset, really finish it up until the end of 2027. So if they start construction this year, you don't need to start operations or really acquire the asset from them until the end of 2027. So effectively, there is still time to really engage with developers that and sort of send that signal out to developers that they should begin project, start that, do what the minimal work they need to do so that they can get that 4-year safe harbor on sites that they think might be really valuable to connect to your system. And do that immediately so that you're able to really get direct pay kind of independently of that domestic content requirement, which we hope, of course, they will also be able to meet because that gives you significant additional ITC and PTC value, and of course, creates jobs locally in communities across the United States. So we will note that this phase out of the domestic content and direct pay, of this sort of the phase out of the tax credit without domestic content direct pay can be waived by the Secretary if that material is unavailable, if you can't really get domestic panels or it raises costs by more than 25% to do so. So there is an out, but it's just not certain. So just wanted to flag that particular risk. And if we can move on to the next slide. I also wanted to flag and acknowledge that there are additional real risks associated with ownership that we also wanted to discuss. Now, that being said, the market has developed some mitigation strategies for these risks associated with owning wind, solar storage, and more broadly, any of these assets. So I wanted to call out in particular a few specific risks because these are relevant ultimately to some of the choices that you'll make between taking the PTC and ITC and whether you choose to go down this path at all. And with wind, we wanted to acknowledge that there are 3 big areas of risk that we see with ownership of a wind asset that can create significant challenges for new asset owners as they're looking at this as an investment. One of the first, and this is a really important point, one that's underappreciated, is when we talk about wind, we know that the resource is volatile. It's not going to be windy in one year the same as it might be windy in a future year. And that's a risk. That's a problem. But we actually would point out the problem with the volatility of the wind resource is actually for an investor, not so much that annual volatility. That's a problem, but it doesn't really it evens out over time usually. The difficulty is that when a developer is developing a wind project, they have to use Met towers. They can't actually put up turbines. Those Met towers give you an estimation of how much wind you think energy you can produce from that wind. But that estimation can often be off, and it's usually biased on the downside. So this resource estimation error, really how much energy can you get out of the wind regime? Unfortunately, that resource estimation error is usually biased on the low side. And so developers will tend to give you what is effectively an estimate of wind that is almost always resource that is almost always high. So this has been an issue, and it has plagued the owners of wind assets across the country. We definitely have seen this. This is seen by a lot of the consultants. There is a bias in the resource estimation process still that hasn't really, as of at least certainly in the last few years, hopefully that's gotten better, but it still exists. And it's a challenge for those who purchase these assets. Now, thankfully, there is an approach to mitigate this. If you have a purchase price adjustment that takes into account actual production in a couple of years after the asset, that is one way to mitigate that risk of resource estimation error. Similarly, we have found that wind assets really, turbines do break, and especially in the first couple of years, there can sometimes be major maintenance issues with certain models of turbines. Again, getting a full wrap O&M contract from a creditworthy counterparty of a OEM is one way to really address that and mitigate that risk to you as a new owner. And then third, there is resource curtailment for any type of PTC assets. That is, if you take a production tax credit, which might have more value, you're at risk that if your system is unable to really use all of that wind, that curtailment can have a double negative repercussion for you, in that you lose the PTCs from it if you can't actually get that wind delivered to you to purchase. And so this may be a reason, if you're concerned about curtailment, to really take the ITC rather than the PTC. Similarly, there are risks in solar, but those are significantly lower. We believe there is panel degradation, but a long-term O&M contract can help. And of course, you might need bridge financing if you choose the investment tax credit. In storage, these are newer technologies, and the batteries always require replacement. Over over a 10-year period, your O&M costs will generally include this, but warranties with a creditworthy counterparty are critical. You need to know that your battery manufacturer, and for solar and wind, especially as we're thinking about domestic content, that you really do have creditworthy counterparties who are going to be around. If they just built new manufacturing facilities, this is also going to be a risk, something important that one needs to be aware of. And this is more generally true. There is a trade-off between getting the domestic content credit 10% adder and often buying panels or batteries from a brand new factory. And so we just want to flag that these are there are opportunities to really invest in and attract producers locally to get that domestic content requirement, build the economy of the regions that you're serving. But at the same time, there are challenges in really making sure that those producers are creditworthy counterparties, that they're going to be around for the next 10 years. And so these are challenges that we want to acknowledge are meaningful and material. And similarly, finally, there are interconnection challenges. It is difficult to interconnect in new clean energy. This has been a challenge. On the other hand, one of the big opportunities with New Era as well is to potentially upgrade existing right-of-way to at your existing facilities or in your system to bring in that new clean energy. This is one of those cases where that challenge is an opportunity for you to deploy capital and actually create a more resilient grid that allows for greater reliability and for your communities and your system. And so we just wanted to acknowledge that there are a lot of risks, but there are some interesting and important mitigation strategies that are available. And at the end of the day, clean energy, particularly particularly wind, solar, and storage, can be still a very attractive option. These are relatively more mature technologies, and while there are risks to ownership, there are mitigation strategies that have evolved over time that make this more attractive than perhaps the last time you may have looked at this option. So we wanted to flag that as something really interesting. And we're happy to quantify some of these risks if you're interested, so please reach out to us. We've done a little bit of thinking about many of these topics moving forward. So if we move on to the next slide, I also want to talk about, in addition to thinking about the risks that we face, there are trade-offs as well. And this is something we discussed quite a bit yesterday. There are trade-offs between an applicant's risk appetite and the possibility of maximizing the net present value of a New Era system award and all of the tax credits. And I referred to this earlier. For example, as I mentioned earlier, if you have a high-quality wind or solar resource, then the net present value benefit of a production tax credit relative to the ITC, for example, in the example that we used yesterday, we found that for solar, the benefit was significant for the solar piece of the facility we modeled yesterday, and as I'll discuss in a little bit, and I'll review that, that provided $170 million in net present value benefit to go for the PTC rather than the ITC. While for the wind, it was quite a bit more than that. The wind resource were very significant. It had a greater capacity factor, and the net present value benefit of getting the PTC relative to the ITC was almost double, or more than double, rather, that of doing so for the solar. Second, I would note, though, that we did that calculation, and the example I'm going to talk you through again was done assuming that you were able to get both the domestic content and the energy communities adders. Without those bonuses, the PTC is even more valuable, because ultimately the PTC value, the increase in the value of the PTC with those two bonuses is really a 20% increase versus a ratio of really about a 67% increase for the ITC with those bonuses. So if you aren't able to get the bonuses, this is even more important to be able to take the PTC. Now, as I mentioned in the last slide, the difficulty with these tax credits and counting on them for equity is definitely that as you are considering the options to really take direct pay, there is some associated risk associated with the existing bonus associated with that domestic content rider being met. So if we go on to the next slide, I just want to review a little bit of the setup of the modeling that we did in light of all of this, and kind of talking through kind of some of these risk issues in light of the example that we gave. And yesterday, the example that we talked about was really a situation where you were going to factor down an existing fossil asset, try to replace some of the generation from it quickly with, it was a, assuming it was a 60% capacity factor gigawatt coal plant, had a $400 million unrecovered net plant balance, so you had some stranded asset issues. You're going to try to factor it down with a significant portfolio of about nearly 2 gigawatts of solar and wind and a gigawatt of storage. You didn't, the constraints that we were playing with is we didn't want to really use additional member equity if we could avoid it, so that we didn't have to increase rates in the near term. That's just to keep it clean and to take a look at the economics as for this asset independently, taking into account any equity raises that would be required. And we wanted to assume a slightly more conservative equity to capitalization ratio of 25%. To avoid any risks of downgrade, to be to try to be conservative in our financial position. And we assumed that if you took the investment tax credit, that you had to have bridge financing for that 5% of the value of that ITC from financing costs. So we looked at different approaches with 0%, 2% treasuries, and we looked at using the remaining grants from the new era to actually take out any bridge financing. And we looked at the option, we assumed that you were going to be trying with these assets to really take the PTC rather than the ITC as much as possible, mainly because, as we saw earlier, the PTC provides nearly $500 million in greater savings if you choose to take them. But the ITC provides an equity infusion. And what we found there is, and just I'm going to go through these really fast. On the next slide, what we found is if you tried to do this with a 0% loan on the PTC, just to remind you, you just basically couldn't use the new era to get enough financing to make it work. You were able to get a big savings if you used a 0% loan to deal with the stranded assets and help you with the financing. You could get $1.6 billion in savings, but you'd need to raise $1 billion in additional capital from somewhere, which doesn't really make this work. So we tried a 0% loan with ITC on the next slide. And indeed, you could make this work with an investment tax credit, but at the cost of significantly reducing the net present value of savings that you would get. That is, the financing benefit of all of your incentives would go down. That is, your levelized cost of electricity benefit from taking this financing would be quite a bit less, and the cost of electricity would be greater if you tried to do this as a 0% loan with ITC. That being said, doing it this way was inefficient from the point of view of looking at this individual project, but it did raise quite a bit of additional equity that you could use to allow you to build other clean energy with ITC or PTC that could create net present value benefits. So it's not totally clear that even though this seems to create for this particular project a lower NPV, it creates some cushion that might allow you to do some additional financing or additional, could allow you to deploy additional capital that could allow you to access greater benefits. And so it isn't completely clear that this isn't viable, but it certainly is a penalty to pay that you wouldn't get that immediate benefit. So if we move on, there are other options. So in a case, there's a very efficient way. If you take a 2% loan with the PTC, you're able to get enough combination of grant from New Era, some ITC from the storage assets that you deployed, to be able to make the debt to equity ratio on this financing work out so that you're actually able to increase the NPV of savings relative even to the 0% case with PTC that was not viable and still managed to raise enough capital. So this is a case where the 2% loan with PTC really allows you to raise just the right amount of equity in order to get what seems to be really a maximal net present value of benefit that lowers the cost of electricity to your members to the greatest degree, for deploying that solar, wind, and storage. However, it doesn't really give you that same cushion of equity that you got to sort of allow you to get savings from other resources that you might want to deploy. So if you're in a situation where you need to be deploying more resources, or you expect that you need to be doing, this might be suboptimal. And then we want to move on to the last case, where we looked at a treasuries loan, but with this allows you to maximize the size of the grant that you're getting from USDA. That allows you to really maximize the net present value of savings and generate some additional equity that allows you to bring in more savings from additional resources you might want to deploy across the system. For instance, if you needed a transmission upgrade, you needed to cover some other costs, or prepare for the deployment of clean firm resources, perhaps later in the decade. And so if we can move on to the next slide. I should also note that these aren't the only models for ownership. And I will note that I've just gone through a whole lot of risks previously while associated with ownership of clean energy assets. If these risks are starting to give you concerns about the ability of you as a cooperative to manage them alone, then I will note that there is another model that is possible even with New Era grants, and especially the ITC, to fully capitalize that. And that is that you can indeed there is enough flexibility in the language for New Era to allow a cooperative to have joint ownership of an asset and get project financing for a joint ownership, an asset with joint ownership. And so this can allow a cooperative to pull into the New Era program an asset that might be partially owned by a developer, in order so that the developer, for example, can mitigate some of those risks by having an ownership stake and managing the project, at least for the first few years, and then perhaps transferring ownership after the 5-year lockup period, which is needed for the investment tax credit, or over another period that works for you, so that you can build up more confidence as being an owner in these assets. And in many ways, this is the kind of an inverse of something called the tax equity flip, or tax structure, where in fact it's you as a G&T or as a distribution cooperative are the one that's able to monetize the tax credits because you've got direct pay. And the developer is really coming in with the knowledge of how to really run the asset and can bring that in a joint ownership circumstance and really help you get comfortable with ownership of the asset and build that capability within your teams. And we think this can be particularly appealing as well for assets with the PTC election, because the developer is there to really kind of bear some of that risk and has skin in the game in making sure that the asset really produces maximal PTCs, really operates in the way that it really needs to be. And in many ways, it can be more applicable or more valuable in that circumstance than if done with an ITC. So moving to the next slide, I should note that the language in New Era also allows for any of these systems, if you deploy a solar storage and wind system, you can indeed include transmission improvements or new transmission in your application process. And indeed, some of our analysis and analysis that's been done by other parties has shown that there is really an enormous amount of benefit to be had by using either advanced reconductoring to improve efficiency of line capacity, which we think can free up a whole lot of interconnection capacity in the next 10 years, and or build additional transmission to harden your system to both improve resilience and to enable the incorporation of greater renewables. So we think this is another important piece of the puzzle to consider as you're thinking about how to use these resources. And finally, just one more slide as I kind of wrap up this particular case. I just want to emphasize the timelines are tight. The opportunity to lock in these tax credits with direct pay without having necessarily to be sure, without having the risk that you might get a downside 10% reduction associated with the cost of meeting the domestic content requirement, is something that is easiest to do if you proactively start conversations immediately. And we just want to note that another way of really reducing your risk in this process is to make sure you run a competitive bidding process with performance guarantees or these, especially with these potential purchase price adjustment mechanisms in place. And that really lets the market work for you. All source procurements in particular where bidders are really asked to deliver particular services, and you really look out at the market to see which combination of solar, wind, and storage really makes the most sense, is a really attractive way to let the market do that work for you and identify the really good developers that can work for your particular needs. And again, we believe that there are opportunities to deploy capital over a longer period of time, and this is the right time to approach developers with an eye towards really developing long-term partnerships to deploy resources over the next decade. Partners in general, and we just want to acknowledge that it's really important to note that both developers and cooperatives are new to this space. So everyone may need coaching to learn how to work with each other on this. So it's helpful to start with some small assets, and obviously really important to bring in some consultants. You want to trust some of the folks that you're working with, but you want to verify, and due diligence is critical. Thankfully, there are methods in place to really make this work. So with that, apologies that I've spoken for quite a while, and I want to move to Q&A to discuss some of these issues further.
Great. Thank you so much, Uday. And before we jump into the Q&A, we know that all of you, the participants in this session, are experts on your system and really would love to hear y'all's questions. So please just drop any questions that you have in the Q&A, and we will do our best to get to the questions. So first, Uday, imagine if you're a cooperative and you're a cooperative leader, and you're trying to decide between going with a PPA or owning an asset. What are some of the first considerations that you would have as you're trying to make that complex decision?
I want to start here by noting that a critical element of this decision really comes from your, as a cooperative leader, I'd want to really understand what capability in my team do I currently have to really evaluate and get comfortable with ownership of a new asset class? Am I in a place where I am able to feel comfortable that either I've got the partnerships or I can get the partnerships to get comfortable with being able to manage an asset like this? Whether right now I am in a position financially to believe that if I'm in a position from a financial perspective such that the benefit of potentially owning these assets is so significant that some of those savings can be used if I don't necessarily feel comfortable that I've got these capabilities to acquire those capabilities relatively quickly. And so, again, I want to make sure that the financial benefits are sufficient to really make it worthwhile. And, ultimately, I want to feel comfortable that I understand and have a good grasp on the potential financial trade-offs involved in choosing one or the other. What do the cost differentials look like? So really, I've got enough market sense of how much of a benefit I can get from choosing to build clean energy relative to purchasing.
Thanks, Uday. Our next question is coming from the audience. Can you expand on what types of costs associated with stranded assets may qualify under New Era? We know this is a challenge that a lot of cooperatives are facing, the stranded asset challenge.
Yeah, and I think, it's important to note that, one way to think about what should be reasonable to put into an application, and really, at the end of the day, the application is going to be judged primarily around emissions reductions. And the easiest case, and really the guidance within the USDA, or the USDA guidance makes clear that the context in which stranded costs are going to be evaluated, or the extent to which those stranded costs can be tied to enabling emissions reductions. So if we're talking about stranded costs that are tied to existing fossil assets that were high emitting assets, or to associated with existing resources that, for example, if they may be transmission resources which were critical barriers, for example, to because of constraints associated with the capacity that could flow around them, along them. If they were critical barriers to deploying clean energy and reducing emissions, that's going to be the type of stranded cost that is going to be looked upon favorably for this application. And I think that's the criteria that USDA is flagging, and that's the one I would use. Is this particular asset a meaningful physical barrier to really deploying resources that can reduce emissions? If the answer to that is yes, and you've got the quantitative analysis around it, that's a cost you should include.
Great. Wanted to double click on one model that you discussed in the later part of your presentation, where third-party equity was combined with either New Era or ITC to capitalize a project. Could you walk us through what the process would look like within that model in a bit more detail?
So maybe I think one of the interesting opportunities with New Era is that the asset does not, to qualify for New Era, the asset does not have to be exclusively owned by an eligible entity. A partially owned asset can apply. So if you found it attractive to partner with a developer, and for example, have a developer put in some equity, have you all, Sharon, put in some equity, have them partially develop what is effectively an ownership structure that allocates most of the tax incentives to you, where you are effectively, your members are purchasing the power, but the developer is receiving some amount of the benefit for their portion of the capital, gets their return relatively quickly in a few years. This is the type of structure that you can use. It's a variable interest entity with an exit. It's a type of structure that's been used in the tax equity space for some time. But here you are a little bit like the bank that is effectively, but you're a little bit more like the bank and the off-taker in such an arrangement. So you, in principle, can eventually get ownership of the asset, but you are bringing to bear both your lower cost of capital and your ability to monetize tax credits into the structure in a unique way. These are, again, we haven't really seen arrangements like this because this is new. And so this would take some time to make work. But again, from a risk-adjusted perspective, this might be really attractive for some cooperatives because of this issue of not feeling necessarily comfortable with ownership. And we'd urge you all to, happy to reach out, talk about how this can work, and to engage with you all to try to figure out if something like this can work for you.
Thanks, Uday. We're going to go to another question coming from the participants with kind of an interesting scenario. Have you ever thought about carbon capture from feedlots and other high-intensity mass enclosed animal production systems in terms of whether that might qualify for emissions reduction or site retirement? Kind of an interesting idea, especially considering that we're talking about a lot of cooperatives that are located in rural areas.
This is really an interesting concept. Again, I think no matter what, carbon capture, especially with storage, permanent storage, should qualify for 45Q. And I would guess that carbon capture from biogenic resources are still actually, relative to capture from and storage from fossil plants, are actually still by far the most attractive way to do storage and use that and achieve and get those credits. And so we believe in, I think, that to me is an extraordinarily interesting opportunity. As to whether it should qualify for this credit, I think that's an interesting question. It is not completely clear to me, but it would be interesting if that was paired as an offset with other measures as a more comprehensive way to reduce the emissions or reduce the net emissions from the system. For example, getting to net zero with a biogenic offset is probably something that will be required at some point. And so this is it's an interesting thing to consider. I'd say we're happy to look at it and talk about it further.
Great. And this is fantastic that we're seeing a stream of questions from participants flowing in. So just want to thank folks for putting those in there. Can you talk, Uday, about the trade-off between maximizing the NPV value and then also managing risk?
And so I think there are a few different trade-offs here. I think most prominent is the one that I identified earlier, which is really there is a significant trade-off and a meaningful one between choosing to take on the production tax credit between making a choice, for example, to take the 2% lending that just provides you the necessary equity, for example, in a certain circumstance. These are all ways in which you can, if you choose to, take a bit more risk to get a greater NPV benefit from your members. Now, you can manage those risks. And so I don't want to leave you with the impression that those risks cannot be managed with some of the mechanisms that we outlined earlier, whether it's whether it's through purchase power, again, with through purchase price adjustments or guarantees, warranties, long-term O&M wraps. There are many ways to address or mitigate some of the risks from clean energy ownership if you make those choices to take incentives that are tied to production and therefore put you more at risk or don't raise as much equity. On the other hand, it is great to have the flexibility within the incentive system to choose not to take those risks and instead bring in third parties, use the investment tax credit to significantly mitigate those risks. Of course, if you do those, you will trade off and you will have a higher levelized cost of electricity. And so the challenge, and I think especially as a financial manager for a cooperative, is to figure out where you feel comfortable. Given your particular system, your workforce, what makes sense for you? How much are you willing to give up in order to, how much value are you willing to give up? And again, a little bit of modeling can help here. We're happy to work with you on that to at least help, give you some contours for what's likely possible. But the market is eventually what's going to really tell you how it prices some of these different risks and what the options are for you.
Thanks, Uday. So for our last question of this portion of the Q&A, we'll go to another question from the participants, and we will be addressing some of the other participant questions coming up in our next round of Q&A. So this question frames out 3 different scenarios, and this question focuses on cost effectiveness. So how does RMI see the cost effectiveness of scenario 1, which is G&T owned, versus scenario 2, G&T and developer joint venture project, versus scenario 3, developer owned? This assumes that the G&T can take advantage of all of the incentives and adders. I would just be eager to kind of hear your thoughts about those 3 different scenarios, Uday.
Yeah, I mean, if we're excluding qualitative risk factors, the G&T ownership is likely to be the most attractive of all of those, just given the lower cost of capital of a larger G&T in particular. G&T developer owned, probably going to be second there. You can take advantage of a good chunk of your long-term cost of capital advantage there. And developers, generally they're going to want to get out quickly, and that means that you won't be paying very long for their higher cost of equity. And then ultimately developer owned, well, you've got a long-term PPA, so you basically shift a lot of risk to them and they want a reward for that risk. So you're going to be paying more. But, again, that might be preferable for you if you don't have the team to work on it. So definitely that's the order that you just laid it out in, is the order of cost effectiveness. But if from a risk adjusted basis, given your particular risk appetite, you might feel differently.
Thanks, Uday. And great to end there on a meaty question, especially considering that we did touch on agriculture earlier. So thanks for that. Move over to Sam.
I can bring back the slides. Progressed one. So we just talked through some of the issues around owning and purchasing wind, solar, and short duration storage, which are pretty readily deployable assets that we see as really important for a lot of new era applications, and we think a lot of cooperatives will be considering. We have 3 more case studies, and these will be a little bit shorter. Next, we'll talk about stranded asset costs, which again are important to especially G&Ts, but a lot of cooperatives that might be applying for new era financing. And then carbon capture and storage and other clean firm resources, and demand and distribution side investments. And all of these are somewhat complex topics. So while we won't spend quite as much time in presentation for these 3 sections, we'd very much welcome and invite your questions, and we'll try to get to as many as possible in our Q&A at the end of the webinar. Next slide, please. So New Era in part was designed to address this challenge, which is facing many cooperatives, especially G&Ts and their members, the distribution cooperatives that own and are served by them, that might own assets that are stranded assets. And we really see this also as important to the competitiveness of applications. So especially in the larger among the larger applicants. Again, New Era is structured in 3 competitive buckets. And RUS has expressed that roughly 60% of funds will go towards applicants that have a total utility plant of over 500 million, which is mostly generation and transmission organizations, and some of those have stranded assets whose costs they might want to be able to address through the program. And that can be important not just for member benefits, which is maybe the primary point, but also really for the competitiveness of this program, given that the program is really designed for maximizing greenhouse gas reductions. So we see this as an important thing for cooperatives to focus on and figure out how to do well. But again, New Era is somewhat flexible in the type of financing that it provides. And there are a number of options that a cooperative interested in addressing stranded asset costs with New Era could use to do so. Going back to some of the points that Uday was making earlier, our view and our modeling shows that really the approach we suggest is to figure out how to maximize the net present value of savings of a project, and consider the ways that you might be resolving stranded asset costs together with the investments in new technologies that might be included in your New Era plan. And that's really because, well, there might be specific levers that seem pretty well suited for the purpose of either restructuring or refinancing the costs you have associated with the stranded asset. Maximizing the NPV allows savings that can be applied to those same purposes with greater member benefits. And so for that reason, we really do recommend thinking about how to make an analysis that looks at these different pieces, addressing stranded asset costs as well as new investments together, and maximizes the NPV savings of that portfolio. Of course, noting that sometimes stranded assets come with unique situations that might require other logistical work or financial work to resolve. But in general, we do suggest the approach of maximizing NPV savings. Next slide. We also do want to call out an additional program that we think could be complementary to New Era for the purpose of focusing on stranded asset costs and really promoting a redevelopment at fossil sites in ways that we think can be pretty supportive of the communities that in which fossil assets are located, but also provide real benefits to the members of a cooperative, for example, as a whole. And so the Department of Energy has a $250 billion lending program called the Energy Infrastructure Reinvestment Program. And so we see possibilities to pair debt financing from the Energy Infrastructure Reinvestment Program, especially for cooperatives that are thinking about pretty large asks from New Era. New Era is a competitive program, and there might be situations where it's beneficial to think about complementary programs like EIR that can help with some of the expensive portions of system transformation that a cooperative might be interested in. And addressing stranded asset costs is one of those that EIR is designed can be used to support. I'll note that there are some complexities in how different federal financing programs are able to work together. And there are rules governing how, for example, different pieces of money from different agencies can be used in concert. And so the agencies are still working out final details and guidance. And this is a place where if participants are interested in talking through details, our team is thinking hard about this issue and would be excited to engage. Next slide. Finally, I wanted to return to the modeling that we've touched on a couple of times, both in the presentation yesterday and today, to note that really this is the situation. What we're modeling is an example where a pretty large coal plant, a 1 gigawatt coal plant with around $400 million in unrecovered plant balance, is factored down more quickly than its original business as usual financial life. And those costs are addressed using a combination of treasury loans and grants and production tax credits in this situation to actually create meaningful savings for customers and provide additional equity for the cooperative. And so just to reiterate that this was not simply a case of building wind, solar, and short duration storage, but that this actually did include refinancing a pretty large stranded asset cost as well. And so a demonstration of why we think this program and why we think the approach of maximizing the NPV benefits is really appealing for this case. So I'll close here by saying that in our view, refinancing stranded asset costs can create really important member savings and can be kind of an essential or big part of an application and a competitive application for the New Era program. And we think that the best approach when thinking through how to structure a funding request that can support resolving stranded asset costs while building new resources is to maximize the net present value of the investments. Next slide, please. This next section we'll go through a little bit more quickly as well. And so again, would welcome questions and answers on places where it would be helpful to dive into more detail. But carbon capture and storage systems are called out specifically with a New Era as an eligible activity, and one we think that a lot of cooperatives will be pretty interested in looking at, especially as they consider ways to how they're thinking about using their larger fossil assets into the future. And so next slide. Here we'll think, this is how we're thinking a little bit about the need for CCS and other clean firm technologies. And first of all, just sort of acknowledging that these can be really important and essential to support grid flexibility and resilience for systems all over the country. And the charts here kind of demonstrate a winter peak in Florida in a time when sort of clean firm resources were really essential to keeping the lights on. And this is sort of a primary need for utilities. And so thinking about technologies that can provide firm supply at the most challenging times for the grid of the year is really important to consider and sort of invited by the New Era program. Next slide, please. And I want to call out a report that our team has found really useful that was recently published by the Department of Energy called the Liftoff Report. And this features a couple of technologies that are pretty important and central to this. And there's a paper on carbon capture and storage, one on long duration storage, one on clean hydrogen. These reports we found valuable in sort of expressing both near-term opportunities and a longer-term view of when the DOE expects technologies to sort of reach market readiness and their potential in sort of creating carbon emission reductions as well as potential pricing for these resources over time. And we'll note here that between New Era and a new tax credit, the Inflation Reduction Act, there are powerful incentives for carbon capture and sequestration. We know a lot of utilities will be thinking about CCS as part of their New Era plans. Something that we think is important to consider is the emissions reductions that will be achievable by 2031 with the deployment of CCS on existing assets, which is something that the program really focuses in on, focusing on the emissions that can be achieved by the end of the program, period. And there might be challenges here, especially in the power sector. In the US, we don't at the moment see CCS operating in the power sector. There are a number of pilots and projects ongoing but those are not operational yet. And it might be a number of years before cooperatives are really able to implement this technology to start creating the savings that the New Era application would value. And so our view on CCS as well, it can be an important technology to consider. Our focus is really on some of the more readily commercially available technologies that can, as we've emphasized, kind of create strength on cooperative balance sheets and put co-ops in a position to use that cushion really to make more investments in the future that can benefit members. And that can include some of these sort of longer term clean firm investments. Next slide, please. This is another chart that we found helpful from the DOE reports that kind of lays out the different qualities of different technologies that utilities might be considering, including their sort of current cost competitiveness. And again, the point that we want to emphasize is that clean firm assets are going to be really, really important and essential for high renewable penetration grids and for utilities across the country. And we see New Era and sort of near-term investments using direct pay tax credits as really important for making investments in technologies that are ready to be deployed very, very soon, very quickly. And that can build the ability to make investments in technologies that are not quite ready for deployment immediately, but allow utilities to have kind of that financial ability to make those investments in the medium term or the slightly longer term. Next slide, please. And with that, I'll turn it back to Uday for our final sort of resource-focused section of the day, and then we'll come to question and answers. So again, I know those two sections went by pretty quickly. Would encourage you to add questions and answers in the chat if you'd like some more detail on any of those points. But Uday, over to you.
Thanks so much, Sam. And I'm going to try to go through this a little bit quickly, but I think it's a really important point, and I wanted to flag, as we'll discuss, that we will return to this, or we do have a plan to return to this in a further, in a follow-up session. So please don't take this sort of quick dive as indication that we're not interested or excited to engage on this. We think it's really important that New Era and the investment tax credit in particular could really play a critical role in not just driving deployment of what we've really focused on, which is a large number of supply-side technologies, but could really enable distribution cooperatives to invest on the demand side in ways that ultimately can also significantly drive emissions reductions, lower bills for customers, and add critical reliability and grid assets to the system. And we see this in three big categories. One is really around the deployment of distributed solar and storage. Distributed solar and storage so far has been limited in its ability to penetrate lower and middle income resident communities, and particularly in rural communities. And part of the reason for this is that we really haven't, so far incentives have not really enabled a lot of Americans to really access distributed solar and storage and its value and benefits. We believe that the investment tax credit and even the PTC in certain circumstances can change this picture dramatically and can include both residential and commercial customers. Second, as we said, there is an opportunity here to really supercharge through New Era and other programs within the USDA and ITC, a more inclusive model of investment that allows for customers to make investments in their own assets on site, along with sort of through the co-op model, facilitating and being part of investments that are made at the system level. And this type of model is one where the utility plays kind of a more of a novel role as continuing to be potentially an owner of assets, but in this case also distributed assets, and facilitating that eventual transfer, for example, over to customers. And third, I think it's really important that that there is a really, and this is an opportunity that we're going to be interested in exploring in greater detail. We believe that there's a significant opportunity for virtual power plants, which is really a grid-integrated aggregation of distributed resources that might be deployed across the distribution co-op service territories that can really mitigate some of the costs system-wide that, for instance, a G&T that serves the distribution co-op may otherwise have in running what might be expensive peaker plants, really kind of replacing what might be the need for reliability services or grid services from a subset of potential supply side assets in ways that might reduce costs for the whole system, for all members, not just necessarily for the members of that distribution co-op. And that's, I think, a really important point. That is, there's a way in which the New Era and ITC, particularly through virtual power plants, can provide value at a system level in ways that are really interesting. We think that this is a really important potential opportunity through New Era and ITC. Next slide, please. As we're thinking about how this is done, we will note that there are some significant problems and challenges to really distribution cooperatives executing on these, or that there were some challenges previously for members of distribution co-ops to really participate and do any of this. And in particular, there were some issues with a lot of members who might have wanted to cite assets. Well, a lot of the incentives came through the tax system, and they didn't have tax liabilities, particularly if they're low and moderate income, or if they're small businesses with very little that have invested in capital and don't have a lot of tax liability. And indeed, some of them, unfortunately, if you are particularly if you're talking about an asset that is a home or a residence, you can't really get direct pay for some of these assets. And some of these assets may be things like, electric vehicles or chargers that can be used and integrated into the grid. You can't do that if you don't have the tax benefits, the tax capacity, if you don't have tax liabilities to do it. And it may also be difficult, particularly we know that cooperatives serve some of the 93% of the persistent poverty counties in the country. And it might be difficult for them for members to provide down payment to finance a solar asset or other grid asset or storage asset. And, cooperative members don't really necessarily know how to take advantage of all of these projects. And here's where distribution co-ops can really make a difference. They can make investments on the demand side in equipment. They can take advantage of incentives. They have direct pay available to them, and eventually they can transfer ownership to the end user if it makes sense or when it works out that way. And so there is an opportunity here for distribution cooperatives to be effectively to be a capital provider here that invests just as they do on the behalf of members in distribution system assets, to go a little bit further and also facilitate investment behind the meter in some of the same ways to deploy assets on the distribution side that might have value across the system. And so moving to the next slide, I would flag that one of these options is to think about ways that essentially a distribution cooperative can serve as something like a tax equity investor with the direct pay option. That is, by having the distribution co-op essentially not serve as a bank, but doing what it does the best: invest in assets on behalf of its rural members, but invest in distribution assets that are that are on the other side of the meter, as well as assets on in the distribution system. Still investing in assets that are fundamentally electric assets. They can effectively create programs that members could opt into, where the distribution co-op really is the initial owner of an asset, but over time, as a member makes payments, flip that asset over to a member depending on the specific rules available. Now, this is going to be dependent on finalized treasury rules for variable ownership. And there are often, for instance, for the case of the ITC assets for solar and storage, the distribution cooperative must own an asset for a few years, and there is risk here for the distribution cooperative to own assets that are on that other side of the meter that I want to acknowledge. So this may be something that is feasible, but we'll just note that this would be a new model, but it's the type of model that wasn't possible before direct pay. It's a new role, and it's worth we again identify this as something worth exploring, potentially with partners who may be, for example, comfortable with solar leasing-like models. These are things that effectively utility-like entities in the private sector were certainly taken on. Now, the advantage is that cooperatives have the financing ability and the ability to monetize tax credits and experience with engaging with these customers to do this work. And so just wanted to flag, this is a really interesting opportunity that distribution co-ops may, should take a look at, and perhaps could be financed in part by New Era. So if we could move on to the next slide. The final thing I wanted to flag, and I wanted to note that we are hoping to host, in particular, a deeper meeting on this particular topic in early July. We believe another significant opportunity for distribution co-ops to really provide what are essential services to cost-effective decarbonization, and could be an important part of an attractive application to the New Era program, is to incorporate what are virtual power plants into their letter of interest. These are essentially aggregating flexible grid resources on the demand side in your service territories to reduce the need for utilization of what are often emissions intensive assets. And we've started to build here at RMI a coalition of providers and interested parties who've been working on virtual power plants called VP3. And we believe that these aggregated resources on the demand side could be an important complement to clean supply side resources, particularly providing, as you think about moving into solar, wind, and storage, providing critical capacity resources that can maintain reliability and improve the affordability of grid while enabling decarbonization and facilitating electrification, bringing in electric vehicles. We think that these kinds of assets could be a powerful way to empower your customers to sort of have investments that allow them to be part of the solution. And we're excited to host a conversation in early July to follow up on it. And so finally, I just want to note and want to acknowledge on the next slide that the challenge with some of these demand side options is that currently the tool that has been deployed by the USDA to demonstrate the benefits of the emissions benefits of assets is not necessarily particularly clearly or obviously friendly towards capturing the benefits of demand-side resources. What the guidance that we just wanted to forward that has been described and discussed in the USDA's presentation so far has been an acknowledgement that ART isn't able to capture this, but a request that entities and distribution cooperatives start in the background developing a theory for what the emissions reductions and benefits associated with these demand-side options in the background, and await further guidance from the USDA in how to include this in their letter of intent and further application process. And so we would urge you to start the process of considering these options in spite of the ART's tools' current inability to really reflect those directly. There is an option really to really perform some of this modeling and incorporate it, for example, into the reduction of system grid losses, for example, and to discuss this in more detail in the notes section in the current tool. So there is a place where it can be entered, but and it is important, and we would flag that it's really important that distribution cooperatives and utilities engage to incorporate this benefit. We also wanted to point out finally that this is an opportunity for distribution co-ops and G&Ts to work together. The new era financing comes with different buckets of money that are being reserved for different co-ops. So you're not necessarily competing against your G&T, but this is an opportunity to work with your G&T to see how you can bring demand-side resources to bear that allow a G&T to decarbonize more aggressively than it otherwise would have, achieve cost reductions, greater cost reductions than it otherwise would have by bringing in resources on the demand side that can facilitate that reduction in cost while mitigating any reliability challenges that might have otherwise arisen. And we believe that this is another really interesting opportunity, particularly with VPPs. And we're looking forward to engaging with you all in a bit more depth to kind of think through how we can help facilitate making the VPPs a real part of a broader set of resources that you might bring to bear in this using these financing mechanisms. Again, we would imagine that, again, New Era can be used, as we discussed, in a way that facilitates what is effectively tax equity, kind of like something like a tax equity financing structure to enable deployment of these resources. And so thank you, appreciate it. I appreciate that we've gone a little bit over in this conversation. I appreciate your patience in sticking with us as I think we want to turn next to our final Q&A session.
Great. Thank you very much, Uday and Sam. And just we'll invite participants to continue dropping questions in the chat, or excuse me, in the Q&A. It was great to see those stream in during the last Q&A, and we'd be eager to get to more during this Q&A. So Uday and Sam, to continue on the theme of collaboration, let's say that you were a G&T looking to partner with distribution co-ops on New Era. What's one of the first questions that you might have or topics that you'd be thinking about? And then also let's look at it from the other perspective. So let's say that you're a distribution co-op thinking about how you can most effectively partner with a G&T. What would you be thinking about if you were in their shoes? Maybe we'll go to Uday first.
Yeah, I think the opportunity here is, as a G&T, for example, is thinking about building its portfolio of resources, there's a real opportunity to potentially engage as soon as possible with their member distribution cooperatives to identify really promising opportunities to perhaps increase the likely availability and potentially decrease the cost in your modeling as a resource modeling as a G&T of potential demand side resources that might be made available through distribution co-ops that might aggressively take on an opportunity to bring in New Era financing to facilitate deployment of demand-side flexibility resources or demand-side resources that might reduce the burden on your system in providing their power. So that's a real opportunity to engage from the G&T side, particularly as you're doing resource modeling to figure out what you could do. On the distribution cooperative side, there's a similar story to really identify if you believe, to engage with your G&T to identify, is your service territory one that might be, creating or be the host or create supply challenges or be responsible for some of the demand that might be driving system costs up, and to really identify if there may be an opportunity for you to deploy, and to go and look out for New Era financing that might help you sort of deploy resources locally that can mitigate some of those challenges, whether it's storage cited on the demand side or on the distribution side or other resources that might be deployed that through a virtual power plant, for example, that might mitigate some of those needs.
I think the only point I'll add here is that I think distribution cooperatives around the country will be seeing requests from their members about new technologies, about options that they'd like to see available to them. And many will be considering options to do that and probably have been even well before the Inflation Reduction Act passed. And so we see New Era as a possibility to really look at the options within the program and see if any of those goals are enabled or more easily enabled through support from USDA.
Great. So to kind of continue on a similar theme, imagine that you're a developer, Uday and Sam. How would you be approaching this opportunity? What would be some of the key things that you'd be thinking about as you're trying to approach this opportunity?
I think personally to follow up, I would be, as a developer, I would be pretty excited about this opportunity. There is, I think, a lot of value here, and probably I'd sort of expect to see a lot of interest from cooperatives to procure or even enter into partnerships to own these resources. As we've talked through, meeting the requirements for the direct pay tax credit requires that projects, or it was easier to achieve if projects are sort of begin construction soon. So as a developer, I would be thinking through ways to start construction on projects that are under or adjacent to cooperative service territories and initiating conversations with cooperatives that might be either takers or ultimate owners of those projects.
Yeah, and I'll just iterate, this is the right time as a developer to be able to go out and reach out to cooperatives. And I think while I think previously it may have been challenging and there have been a lot of barriers between the interests of developers and those of G&Ts and distribution co-ops and a lot of friction and challenges here, there are really more opportunities now for partnerships rather than fights really around resource provision. And the quicker the developers move to start looking at opportunities in cooperative service territories in partnership with co-ops, the more likely it's going to be that both that the communities, that rural communities, the developers, that the cooperatives themselves are going to be able to ultimately benefit from this process. So this is the right time as a developer to create, to reach out. There are win-wins available here.
Great. And now we'll shift to a question from the participants. Curious if funds can be used for a feasibility study for emerging technologies.
Again, maybe I'll weigh in a little bit here. I think one of the challenges, and I think one of the takeaways we hope from a lot of the analysis that we've done is we really find that this program is best suited, and you will have the greatest chance of success from the program if you are able to demonstrate relatively rapid emissions reductions. And those emissions reductions are most likely going to come from quick deployment of commercially available resources. So it can be, this may not be the best pot of money to really look at studies like that. This is really a better pot of money to focus on deployment of resources that can really maximize near-term emissions reductions and create the financial space for thinking through and addressing these other needs moving forward through likely other mechanisms. There is funding available from the DOE, and I think that money is the best money really to be brought in to use for feasibility studies for emerging technologies. That's exactly what the Department of Energy is there for. It really is there to fund that kind of work and to enable that type of investment and engagement. And they are able to finance and support that kind of work in a way that I think this program is perhaps not quite as well suited to do. So I would focus more on deployment in the near term and really engage with the Department of Energy and partner with them to get the help and support that you need to really develop and to engage on emerging technologies on a forward-looking basis. It would be my advice on this particular application to get the greatest chance of success for getting the funding.
Thanks for that, Sam and Uday. Move to a question that actually was recently mentioned in an article in the New York Times about the different incentives in IRA. So this is another question from a participant wondering where participants can find guidance on the construction 4-year safe harbor rule, and then also what activities constitute quote unquote construction to take advantage of the domestic content bonus.
So the safe harbor guidance is something we can actually send you a link. We'll make that link available on our website just so that you have it available. The rough, basically there are 2 criteria that are used, and if I get this wrong, I'll correct myself later. But they are both relatively straightforward to meet. One is that 5% of project costs have been incurred, I believe, is the criteria, and another is that you have essentially contracted for some major property is roughly is what's needed, and both of these can be accomplished in a way that's relatively easy to execute on, and especially for example. One example I'll give is that this guidance has existed and it has sort of mitigated some of the challenges around what has been very volatile extensions of the tax credits. And so, for example, one option, one of the things that we've seen developers do is go out and get and enter into long-term purchase or into agreements to purchase panels or wind turbines from a supplier for a large number of sites that they may own or contract with. And that, to a good degree, is one way that a lot of developers, particularly with scale, can establish that start of construction on a large number of sites fairly early in ways that are not necessarily that difficult to do. And again, I would encourage you to work with developers to do this who have more experience with dealing with the start of construction necessarily, rather than doing it on your own. And one other thing I should note is, this is important for distribution cooperative members, and I don't think I mentioned this. If we're talking about community scale solar that's less than a megawatt, these penalties do not apply. And so if you're really just building something small, you don't have to worry about it. If you're doing a bunch of distributed resource deployments, you don't have to think about either of these issues so much. You don't have to worry about the penalty on the domestic content side. You still have, of course, a bonus if you're able to achieve it. So that's something that is worth thinking about. So, but you don't have to worry about the penalty on the direct pay.
Thanks, Uday. So we've talked a lot about pairing ITC and PTC with New Era, and wanted to see if we could chat a bit more about pairing New Era with EIR and some of the opportunities and also the complexities of pairing New Era with the Energy Infrastructure Reinvestment Program that's coming from the DOE.
Or maybe I'll take a quick crack at that. So the New Era Energy Infrastructure Reinvestment Program provides low-cost lending at 37.5 basis points above treasuries that can be really attractive as a complement to the New Era. The EIR program offers this as a complement to New Era. In principle, the challenge here is that the way that the DOE's guidance works, or the way that the DOE program works, it is not able to provide funding that would be effectively paid off by another government program. So, for example, if the DOE provides financing, that financing cannot be paid off by a grant from the USDA. That's money going from one pocket to another, and that's prohibited in the DOE program. So in principle, for an asset that is if you're going to be getting the New Era financing, and you get, for example, a large amount of grant and want to use the DOE EIR for lending, you are not going to be able to use the USDA grant to repay in any meaningful way the DOE lending program. And for the purposes of the amount of financing the DOE can provide, it will disregard any federal financing as a potential cost share. So, for example, that would limit the amount of, that will require, for example, that equity from other sources be used to meet a requirement that the DOE has, that it can finance no more than 80% of a particular project's cost. Now, it is not yet clear whether that 20% could come from the ITC direct pay, for example, however, because tax credits have been excluded from many of these restrictions. So there is still some ambiguity, but it seems like it could be possible for a cooperative to get to essentially combine New Era with some level of ITC and an EIR in a project, as long as that EIR lending plus the ITC are enough to meet the 80%, no more than 80% of project costs met by the DOE lending requirement. So it is possible that EIR could be stacked with these other facilities. The other option is EIR can be used for complementary financing for what is effectively a project that is not included in the scope of the projects that are put into your New Era grant, but may be complementary and important. For example, if you're doing transmission reconductoring, you can get financing specifically from EIR for that piece of the puzzle, or perhaps just for the storage asset, and not ask for that from USDA, and therefore use both of them and use the DOE or use the USDA program, for example, use the DOE program, the EIR program, to deal with the stranded asset costs included, which are allowed as part of the refinancing package that the DOE can provide. So there are ways that you can combine these and stack them. You just can't, you have to be careful to make sure that you are never asking the DOE to essentially finance something that will be repaid by the USDA in any meaningful way, or that incorporates the USDA grant in the cost share requirement that the DOE requires on its side. That's the place where you need to be really careful.
Thanks a lot for that, Uday. Before moving to our final question, I just do want to thank participants again for putting those questions in the Q&A. I think we had about half of the questions coming from participants, so that was fantastic. Really appreciate y'all putting those in. Our final question is for both Sam and Uday. Would be great to hear from y'all about the types of support that RMI is interested in providing cooperatives during this crucial time, the summer period where folks are working on their applications. If y'all could chat a bit more about that, that would be fantastic.
Maybe I'll let Sam begin, and I'm happy to.
Yeah. So we are hoping to provide support in a number of ways. One is where there are topics that we think will have broad interest and usefulness. We can host future trainings like this, and again, would appreciate hearing from people and feedback the types of material and content that would be most useful. We also are planning to make available more referenceable materials. And finally, we're happy to engage in a one-on-one capacity or in a smaller setting to answer questions in a more focused way and talk through some of these issues in more detail, and even potentially get into specifics about the systems of people who are thinking about applications. And so, yeah, an invitation to reach out with any questions, and we can work through how to best support.
And maybe just before we move over to Uday, I just want to also add one comment onto what Sam just said. We are able to enter into NDA, as we do understand that a lot of this information may be confidential in terms of those collaborations. So I just wanted to add that on. Move over to Uday.
The final thing I will say is that I also wanted to, in addition to Sam's answer, I do want to flag again that we do have planned in July already we have not fixed the date yet, but we are certainly planning to work with our team working on virtual power plants to bring a training specifically aimed at cooperatives in trying to sort of bring together stakeholders to help hopefully help clarify some of the opportunities and help facilitate conversations around the utilization of virtual power plants. So we want to make sure that that's something that you all are aware of. And we also wanted to invite any feedback that you all have on this presentation and any ideas that you may have for additional work that you'd like to see us focus in on at a training level. And again, invite one-on-one conversations either under NDA or not. We're very excited to see how we can be of service to you all. We have a team, RMI has I think we're at about 700 people worldwide, and we have pretty big teams working on many of these clean energy topics. We'd love to bring those resources to bear if we can, and bring the right experts to you, hopefully to be helpful to answer some of the questions that you have as you're entering this LOI period. So please do reach out, and we'll try our best to be supportive. And thank you again. I know that we've gone over, and we really appreciate you taking the time to join in the conversation.
Yes, thank you, everyone. And as we close, we're going to put up a final slide, which reviews some of these next steps that we've just talked through in ways that we're able to offer support. This includes a QR link to a feedback survey for this question. I know we've also posted a link to this chat. And again, very much appreciate your time, and would also appreciate your thoughts and comments on this session to help us provide even more valuable content over the course of the summer. We know this will be a busy time for lots of folks on this call as you review and sort through the guidance and structure applications for New Era. With that, we'll close. Thank you again, and please feel free to reach out directly with any questions or comments.